Welcome back, Year 5. In today's math lesson, we'll be focusing on understanding decimals. Now, this is going to be a quite in-depth lesson. It's a very meaty one, so we've got 3 learning intentions that we're focusing on. The first is to recall the names of the first 2 places to the right of the decimal point. Then we'll determine the value of the digits in the tenths or the hundredths place. Finally, we'll show the relationship between decimals and fractions. Now, this might sound like a lot of work to do in one lesson, but these learning intentions are very closely related, and understanding one will really help you to understand another. So make sure you have your notebook and follow along with me as we work through these problems. Our first learning intention is to know the names of the first 2 places to the right of the decimal point. So take a look at this place value chart. We see our decimal point in the center with the whole numbers to the left and the parts to the right. All those parts are numbers that are smaller than 1. That is why they are to the right of the ones place, or the right of the decimal point. So tenths come immediately after the decimal point, and they are followed by the hundredths. After the hundredths is the thousands. Today we're only focusing on tenths and hundredths, but you can keep in mind that thousands come after that. You might also notice a pattern. Tenths are to the right of the ones, and tens are to the left of the ones. Do you see another pattern? Those lines underneath show the relationship between the parts and the wholes. However, I need you to keep in mind that tenths and hundredths are smaller than 1. They are not larger. That's going to be vitally important to understand as we move forward in this lesson. Now let me show you why it is that tenths and hundredths are smaller than ones. Here you can see some base 10 blocks, and they're going in order of our place value for whole numbers. We have the ones, tens, hundreds, and thousands. How do I get from a 1 to a 10? Well, I have to multiply by 10. To get from a 10 to a 100, I also have to multiply by 10. And to get from a 100 to a 1,000, I also have to multiply by 10. Now, what about the reverse? To get from 1,000 to 100, I have to divide by 10. So I take 1,000, split it into 10 equal parts, and each part will be 100. If I take 100 and split it into 10 equal parts, I'll have 10. And you can actually see that nicely here because the hundreds can be split into rows and columns of 10. Same with a 10. If I split it into 10 equal parts, I'll get 1. Now let's move to the right of that decimal point. So as I was just saying, you have to keep dividing by 10 as you move to the right, as you get smaller. So if I have a 1 and I divide that by 10, I'm going to end up in the tenths place. So what I've done is I've taken a little magnifying glass and I've zoomed in on a 1, that little yellow square. And if I zoom in on it, I can imagine that I've split it into 10 equal parts. And one of those parts, the one that you see shaded in green, is worth 1/10. Now you can see that fraction written right there. 1/10 is the same thing as having 0.1, a 1 in the tenths place. What about the hundredths? Well, I've zoomed in a little bit more and I've taken those tenths and I've split them into 10 equal groups. And now that 1 square that I had has been split up into 100 little pieces, or hundredths. One little square, see that green one I have shaded? That one little square is worth 1/100th because it's 1 out of 100 little pieces, and it takes 100 of those pieces all together to form just one whole, as we can see in the ones place. So 1/100th, or 1 over 100, is the same thing as having 0.01, or a 1 in the hundredths place. To help us visualize this even more clearly, I've put up 8 examples of illustrations that represent decimal values. Now, each of these 8 squares represents one whole. So the whole square is worth 1 whole. However, only part of it has been shaded in red. That part that's shaded in red is worth less than 1 because the whole box is worth 1. And it's smaller than the whole box. That means I'm looking at a decimal value. What I'm going to do is show you how I can understand what those shaded regions mean. What would they look like as a decimal, and what would they look like as a fraction? Well, let's start with A. I see that it has been split up into 100 equal parts, or hundredths. That means each little square is worth 1/100th, or 0.01. So what I can do is count all those little squares and see how many of them I have. If you're nice and clever, you'll realize that each column is worth 10. That means I have 2 10s plus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 more. So I have 26/100ths shaded in. What does that look like as a decimal and a fraction? Well, here's what it would look like. 0.26, or as a fraction, 26/100, because 26 out of 100 pieces are shaded. To understand that decimal a little bit better, I see that we have 0.2 in the tens place and 6 in the hundredths place. Do I have 2/10ths in that illustration of A? Actually, I do. Even though A hasn't been split into just 10 equal sections, but 100, I can imagine that those columns, those two columns that are shaded in, well, they're 2 out of 10 columns. It takes 10 columns to make up the whole thing. So I have 2/10ths shaded in, along with 6 more little squares. And together, they make 26/100ths, or 0.26. What about B? How many parts has B been split into? Well, it's been split into 10 parts. That means we're dealing with tenths. How many tenths are shaded in? And what would that look like as a fraction? Well, I can see that 4/10ths are shaded in when I count them. So that would look like 4/10 as a fraction, or 0.4, because that place directly after the decimal point is the tenths place, and I have 4/10ths shaded in. What about C? We've gone back to hundredths, but let's break this one down. As I said before, you can imagine that in this hundred square, we still have groups of 10. How many full groups of 10 do you see? 1, 2, 3, 4. That means we have 4/10ths, so I would put a 4 in the tens place. What about individual hundredths, just those itty bitty squares? I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that would mean a 5 goes in the hundredths place. So what would this look like as a decimal and a fraction? Well, as you can see, as a decimal, it would read 0.45, because there are 4/10ths, or 4 complete rows, or columns, rather, and there are 5 small hundredths, those individual little squares. That's the same as having 45 pieces out of 100, because 45 of the little squares are shaded in. Now remember, this is so important. Every column, every full column, is the same thing as 1/10th. And that's because there are 10 little pieces in each column. And 10 hundredths makes 1/10th. Let's look at D now. That one is split into tenths. So each column or row is worth 1/10th. So what would this look like as a decimal or a fraction? Well, only one column, or rather row, one row was shaded in, so that means 1/10th was shaded in. So in my 10th place, I would put a 1. There are no smaller hundredths shaded in, so I don't need to put anything in the hundredths place. So my fraction is going to say 1/10, because we're dealing with tenths. Now what I'm going to do next is fill in all the answers for E, F, G, and H. And then I'm going to ask that you pause the video and check, are my answers correct? How do you know that they are correct? Talk to your parents about it, or if you have a sibling, explain it to your sibling. Now it's time for your independent work, which will appear next. There are 2 pages, so you're going to need to pause twice to see what your assignments are. This is the first assignment, which is a lot like what I did with you earlier. You're going to look at each illustration and determine if it's been split into tenths or hundredths. Then you will write the decimal value of the shaded region and the fraction value of the shaded region. For example, number 1 I can see has been split into tenths. So my answer should be 0 point something, just one digit after the decimal point. However, number 2 has been split into hundredths. So my answer should be 0 point something something, because hundredths can be broken down into tenths and hundredths because I have full column shaded in along with some more little pieces. If you need to, go back and re-watch what I did earlier in the similar problems. This is your second assignment. There are a bunch of decimal values on this page. You are being asked to convert these to fractions. It says to simplify if possible, but I'm not going to ask you to do that. Simply write the fraction. For example, number 1 says 0.48. To write that as a fraction, I need to think to myself, well, what places am I dealing with? I have tenths and hundredths. This would look like 48 over 100 because I have 4 tenths and 8 hundredths. And 4 tenths is the same as 40 hundredths. So I put those together. I have 40 and 8 hundredths. So 48 over 100. Number 2, on the other hand, 0.2, is simply 2 tenths. So I would write 2 over 10. Again, if you need to, go back and re-watch the part that I guided you through earlier so you can see the relationship between the decimals and the fractions. As always, don't forget to send me a picture of your work and stay safe. I'll see you soon.